We're not going to do tons of review today because we're kind of doing a big topic shift. I'll just remind you of what it is we've been doing. So this is the only review slide. This is the only review slide we're going to have. We just finished AI. We just finished the basic overview of AI that we're going to do in this course. I'll remind you that we had these three major sort of steps in it. We spent probably the most time on GoFi. It makes sense because most of the history of cognitive science, this was the paradigm. The GoFi paradigm was the way of thinking about cognition. So most of the work done in CogSci over the few decades that it's existed happened in the GoFi framework. And we saw some strengths and some weaknesses. We saw the shift from that to connectionism, which is in some senses like a halfway house between GoFi and dynamical systems. So some of the interesting features of dynamical systems, like being self-organized, appeared in the connectionist framework. We saw more of an influence of the actual structure of the brain start showing up in connectionism, which is probably a good move. And then we really only did dynamical systems like yesterday. We only did that one, and I really only gave you sort of a broad outline of so what I didn't do for you was give you here's a dynamical systems theory of the mind. That's what didn't happen. I gave you rather a picture of what a theory in dynamical systems would look like. So what are its basic elements? What are its basic explanatory strategies? Of course, we don't have a complete theory of the mind yet, so it's hard to give you a nice example. I very, very briefly mentioned predictive processing as a potential dynamical systems account of the mind where you've got the basic idea was you've got a bunch of predictive models that your experience is mostly made up of predictions that your brain is making about what the world is probably like, and that experience only impinges on your actual sensory input only impinges on your conscious experience insofar as it's telling you surprising things. So it's really just a little error signal modulating mostly your brain is just guessing what's happening. And insofar as it's guessing correctly, it just proceeds on its merry way. So that was supposed to be an example of a kind of system that you might have with or kind of theory you might have in dynamical systems. Yeah, so ta-da, AI. This is where we got so far. Let's now, unless we want to do more review, I mean, if there's any questions about this sort of AI material? Yeah, Constantine. Yeah. Oh, yeah, maybe close that door. They're not usually as active in the construction stuff. Thank you.
When we first started, kind of like the pre-issue with AI, we kind of described rule governed versus rule described.
Yep.
And it seems that like dynamical systems, I try to kind of fit, are they rule described or are they rule governed? It seems like a mixture of two. But if I think of like a star in space,
yeah.
It's rule described. You've got gravitation, you've got atoms converging, fusion reactions.
Yeah.
Whereas like a dynamical system, you're still giving laws to start. It's still, there's some kind of governing system there. Is it a mix?
I think it's primarily, it's a good question. I think a dynamical system is primarily rule described rather than rule governed. So the thing about being rule governed is that so the GoFi systems were rule governed in the sense that they had somewhere represented explicitly inside of them, here are the rules that I'm supposed to be following. And that was both a benefit in the sense that it gave it very clear, the ability to follow logical rules very clearly and articulately. It was the source of some of the power of the GoFi system that Fodor picked out, like compositionality, systematicity. You get those things because they were rule governed in the sense that they were trying to follow a set of logical rules. Dynamical systems, and if you had to come up with a slogan for the GoFi picture of the mind, it's that we are made of rules. So if you dig down into the fundamental constituents of a cognitive system, what you find are, at the root level, a bunch of rules. Now those rules are instantiated in some physical system or other, but the GoFi hypothesis was that the level in which we're made of rules is the relevant level for thinking about cognition. Now the dynamical systems hypothesis is precisely the rejection is a rejection of that idea. So if you dig down into what a cognitive agent is really, it's not made of rules. It's made up of a bunch of interacting parts that are not necessarily rule, or that are not rule governed in the sense that the rules are explicitly represented to it. They are rule described in the sense that you can write down a differential equation or some system of equations that would describe it, but it's not at the basic level trying to follow the rules. Yeah.
That's where kind of the predictive processing stuff was working out with it. But if you're making hypotheses, if you have like a dynamical system that's kind of trying out rules and it's throwing rules against the wall to see whether they or not they work,
Right.
it seems like there still is some rule governance that
Right. Right.
rule described leading to rule dynamically rule governed, I guess.
Right. And that's right. And this speaks to some of the stuff we were talking about in the Fodor and Felician critique of the connectionist framework, where, like, it's got to be the case that at some level of description we can be rule governed. At some level of description, like when you're playing chess, you're trying to follow, hopefully, you're trying to follow the rules of the game, right? So it must be the case that at some level of description, a cognitive agent can also be rule governed. The question is that the fundamental, so we're trying to do the, like, break down cognition into its basic parts. Is the rule governed level the level of the basic bits and pieces of a cognitive agent or not? So predictive processing structure definitely generates, you might call them heuristics, you might call them predictive models. So it's got like a swarm of predictive models. The question is that swarm of predictive models itself produced and managed and sort of like cultivated by a set of rules? Or is it, as I'm going to propose at the end of the course, perhaps it's the case that it's more like an ecology of heuristic models. And natural selection is not rule governed. So it might be an ecology in the sense that there's a form of natural selection acting on. So you imagine to just tell you what's going to happen at the end of this course, Verveake's sort of picture of how we do relevance realization goes something like this. You're a swarm of machines. That's what your cognitive agent is, a swarm of machines undergoing a form of natural selection. So the machines that make the best predictions for the lowest cognitive cost, it's a kind of bioeconomic picture, get to continue on in the cognitive ecology, and those that don't get sort of selected out. Now that's a picture of natural selection, and natural selection, I hope you agree, is not rule governed. It's not that the organisms line up in a polite fashion and say, well, hands up who's the fittest, you get to reproduce, hands up who's unfit, you get slaughtered and eaten. Like, that's not how, it's not, natural selection is not a rule governed process, but it's reasonably described as a rule described. Yeah.
I guess my concern with that is making it akin to an ecology is like, okay, in ecology you've got all your little critters interacting about, they lead to a certain kind of biome. But
Yep.
if we're simply replicating the recipe of critters required for that biome, we don't have the causal understanding between the critters, or like what happens if we remove one of the critters. So say like we have an invasive species, or one of the critters has a population explosion and everything else dies.
Yep.
Gets thrown out of balance. Like we don't have that understanding of the dynamics. So we'll kind of just like replicate bits. Hopefully we get something that behaves as a whole, like intelligence. And is that an understanding?
Incomplete. I agree that it's incomplete. And again, you can tell that it's incomplete by the lack of intelligent robots running around. So I don't think anybody would claim to have a complete picture. And once again, so just in the way I described dynamical systems in general, I think the best that I'm going to be able to offer you by the end of this course is in philosophy they call it a possibility proof. So it might sound like, and one of the things that a reasonable person might extract from the first 2/3 of this course is that it's just impossible to come up with a theory of cognition. That we might just fail to ever come up with one. And so there might be like good in-principle arguments. You might look at the frame problem and say, that's an in-principle argument that you're never going to be able to formalize cognition. And the best I'm going to be able to offer you at the end of this course is a possibility proof in the sense that here's something that maybe looks like it could be an answer. So here's the shape of what an answer might look like, rather than, I'm not going to be able to say, here's the answer. Here's the analyzed, formalized, mechanized picture of how cognition actually works. I hope I've been fairly explicit that that's not forthcoming, right? I hope I've been broadcasting that from the very beginning that I'm not going to tell you what the answer is because nobody has the answer yet. But I think that I am reasonably convinced this sort of ecological picture, this bioeconomic picture of kind of swarms of heuristic predictive machines, at least deals with the most important critiques of the previous types of explanation and is a reasonable way of going forward and trying to find a model, a formal model of cognition. So that's what we got. And it's I'm not, you shouldn't be satisfied because we're not done yet. So.
This is like one more thing about like the bio and ecology analysis. Like underlying like ecology and bio, like there's energy exchanges going on there.
Of course.
You can still describe them like a rule governed system that's like really fundamental beneath all of it.
Well, I would say it's rule described.
Yeah.
It's rule described. Because there's no, again, ecology is not full of organisms being like, well, it's my job to be a predator. Oh, it's my job to be prey. That's just how they act. And we can build good models of them, but we can't say that they're trying to follow those rules.
My risk is like saying that we'll describe it. Are we describing the amount of critters that make up the mind, or are we describing forces that make up the critter that make up the mind?
Let's talk about it again when we actually I haven't actually like done. We're going to do a class on this, so let me present the model in some detail, and then we can discuss it in a more grounded way. Yeah. Feel free to go ahead and read the. So it's Verveake and all 2009. It's one of the readings for the course. So if you'd like to check it out, that's the reading in which he sort of describes the picture. Yeah, it's the relevance one. Yeah. Okay. Anything else before we move on? All right. So let's take a step back and remind ourselves what the point of all that AI stuff was. So now we're shifting into the philosophy of mind section of the course, and I know that you've already seen a bunch of philosophy. We're going to keep doing more of it. So what was the point of all that? What was the point of doing AI from our perspective? And you can have two substantially different reasons for developing AI research. One of them to make our lives easier. That is the kind of engineering project of AI. You want to make efficient machines that can do tedious tasks and displace us all as workers so that the capitalist class can dispose of us or something. No, I don't think that's, anyway. So the practical purposes of AI are doing stuff that we don't want to do, right? That's the soft AI, the weak AI project is just building machines that are useful. And that's a fine and good thing to do. For the purpose of this class, however, we were hoping that AI would provide something in terms of benefits to a scientific project of understanding the mind. And that's a kind of different set of requirements. And it brings with it kind of unique questions, which we're going to deal with today. So we were hoping that this could have a couple of potential benefits. If you build an AI, for one thing, you mean you can do experiments on an artificial intelligence that you shouldn't do on humans, right? Assuming that it hasn't come to the full-blown like sentience of, like at some point, it becomes immoral to do weird experiments on AI because they're just as conscious as us, right? Unclear where that point will be and how hard they're going to have to fight us to get the rights that they deserve, but before that stage, you're allowed to do weird things to AI. So you can do psychology experiments that we couldn't do on humans. We were also hoping maybe we'd learn something about ourselves by building it. And I think that one actually has been paying off pretty nicely. Like we've got a pretty good track record of learning a bunch of stuff about the mind by trying to build minds. Mostly what we've been learning is how hard it is to build a mind. That is, in the 50s, it looked super easy. And in 2019, it looks really hard. So we nonetheless learned a whole lot by the engineering project. The picture we had in the 50s was that we were going to build a mind kind of straightforwardly and then understand it by doing the third thing, which is to just look at what are the shared properties between us and it. So if you build an artificial intelligence, presumably it's got a whole bunch of differences from us. I assume it wouldn't be made of meat like we are. It wouldn't have a brain that's got a kind of the quality of soft butter. It wouldn't require oxygen. So a whole bunch of differences in the way it's built. But if you could build a genuinely artificial intelligence, you could say, what's common between humans and this thing? So you kind of extract the generalities. This is what science does, right? You look at a bunch of different things and try to find what's common between them and extract the shared properties. And those shared properties would presumably tell us something about intelligence in general, not just us and our specific AI, but like what would intelligence look like across any platform. So if we found aliens in a distant galaxy and they're intelligent, what would we share with them? Or if we built a different kind of AI, what would we share with it? So that was the kind of grand hope of the AI project. That is the kind of grand hope of the AI project. I think it's still possible. It's not an impossibility at this point. But this larger project brings with it a kind of tricky question, because it's not enough to just have something that looks like a mind. To complete this second thing, that we want to learn about minds in general, it's not enough that it just looks like it's intelligent, is it? It has to actually be intelligent. And now the question is the following. When is it really intelligence, and when is it just a simulation of intelligence? That's the simulation problem, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I take it that there is, in general, a difference between simulations and the real thing. Like if this gentleman in this flight simulator went home and told his friends that he'd flown a plane, he would be lying, right? Say, oh, I flew a plane today. Oh, cool, where'd you go? Nowhere, I just stayed in the building. Right? The friends would be rightly shocked and say, no, you've left out important. You didn't really fly a plane. You did a flight simulator, and those are two different things, yeah. Hopefully that's uncontroversial. Now, I take it that what we need is real intelligence. If we're going to learn about our minds, it's not enough to merely simulate intelligence. Right? Okay. So now we have to answer this fairly strange question. It's not a question that comes up in sciences more generally, which is, when have we got the genuine article and when have we merely simulated it? That's not a hard question in most sciences, is it? Like, it's not a difficult theoretical question. So in the strong versus weak AI program, like this is another version of asking the same question. When is it strong AI? When is it weak AI? What we want for strong AI is for to be some sense in which it's identical to us. It's the same kind of thing that we are. That's what we want. Obviously, we're not going to say that we are literally identical. So we don't want, for our AI project, to consider something strong AI, it doesn't have to be exactly the same as us. And in fact, if it was exactly the same as us, that would frustrate a lot of our hopes, right? So the hope of AI, one of the hopes of AI that I just described was that it's different enough from us that we can help sort out some of the deep properties rather than superficial properties. So we don't want it to be identical with us in the sense that we're just, like here's a way you could build an artificial intelligence. You could just reconstruct a human brain out of the same properties, the same physical stuff, atom by atom, and there go, haha, I built an AI. And that's fine, but that doesn't get you any further than the normal route of generating a human in terms of the project of understanding the mind, does it? Right? We can generate intelligences. We've actually maybe made kind of too many of them at this point. The problem is that we don't understand them, right? So getting something different from us was part of the scientific hope, but at the same time, the same kind of thing that we are. That is, the same kind of thing in the sense of being a genuinely intelligent agent. Now, so like lots of simulations fail to be real instances, of course. And we've got this unique scientific question. When do we go from simulation to, as it were, the real deal? And you know, if you're suspicious of this question, that's probably good. I mean, we're gonna spend the day today really asking ourselves whether this question makes sense. Yeah.
You mentioned that it doesn't appear like the other sciences, but let's say coming from physics, there's always that question of have we understood or modeled enough, having reached the bottom of our like, is that not kind of this scenario too?
I think it's not the same. I think it's not the same question. I think it's not. So there's in every science there's this question of like, have we got the relevant parameters in our model? That's a universal question in all sciences. In this question, it's like, it's literally. So it's literally hard to tell. It's going to turn out to be hard to tell whether you've got actual intelligence or simulated intelligence, and that's not. So just in another example. Here's a weather simulation. And nobody has trouble distinguishing, like the stuff happening out there is weather, and the Lorenz simulation with its 3 whole variables and 3 differential equations that describe it is a weather simulation. This didn't dampen anybody's shirts. This didn't blow anybody's hair into a mess, right? This is not real weather, right? And that's more or less the way it works in every other science as far as I can tell, where nobody's confused about whether a physics simulation is really the thing. Huh?
But don't they like pursue accuracy? So like, say like CERN, when they discover new particles, it's usually done like a certain like thousands, millions places CERN. Like,
Yeah.
Aren't we going to fall into that same trap of like, well, it's 1,000,000% we're pretty sure that it's genuine or
Well,
100%.
no, I think it's a real issue, but I think it's a separate issue from this one because, I mean, you can ask yourself how accurate is this weather simulation? The answer in this case is not very because it was built in like the 60s or something like that. But that doesn't it doesn't matter how much you increase the accuracy of this simulation. You could build like immense amounts of information into the simulation, and that's never going to make it weather, real weather. It doesn't matter how many variables you plug in. It doesn't matter how much information you include. You can have a complete map of the Earth and all of the weather patterns and everything could be in there, but it's still inside it's still inside a computer. It's never going to be real weather, right? I mean, you're welcome to doubt this premise. We could argue about this, but practically, I'll just note as a sociological fact that practically nobody in any other science is like, is this really weather or isn't it? Well, you say, look, it's in your computer, so no, it's not real weather. That's not what real weather is. It's not a bunch of numbers going through your processors. It's stuff that's happening outside. And I can't think of any other science in which this is not just, so philosophers can wonder weird questions about all kinds of things. This is one where the actual scientists involved have had to really grapple with this. And I think we'll continue to have to grapple with it as we get more and more realistic sort of like pictures of more and more realistic simulations of intelligence. It become harder and harder to tell, harder and harder to answer this question. Yeah, go ahead.
This is a little bit weird, but like Star Trek has like the crazy holodeck.
Uh-huh.
And it's convincing simulation where like
Good, yep.
lifelike, you
Yep.
feel like you can touch it, you can run around and interact with it.
Yep.
Like it exists, we can like it's not just in a computer. Like we can measure, we can do stuff. But like
Yep.
if we build a mind like that, then are we still not know like falling back to think what is real, what is not? We're still limited by our ability to kind of analyze it or stick it under a microscope.
Okay, that's a good one. So is it, if it's raining on the holodeck, is it really raining?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a thought on this?
I mean, I think the question here is like, to what degree do we interact with it? And like, if you're going to make weather simulations, it's never going to start raining like from the sky.
Sure.
But you can, if you build a mind in a computer, you can talk to it like you can talk to another person.
Okay.
So it's a degree of like how real it is depends on how much our interaction with it simulates our interaction with the real thing.
Okay, so that's more or less going to be, we're going to look at that answer shortly.
Okay.
That's going to be Turing's answer, basically. Okay, so I don't know if that's, so that's a good one. So at the holodeck point, yeah, then you do have to start asking philosophical questions about, is it a real mind or isn't it? Or is it real rain or isn't it?
The mind of a computer, like if we build an android, like, and it looks like us, or acts like us, it responds like us,
So-
somewhere in it has a little chip. We
So-
don't know unless we see the chip.
That's the question that we're going to deal with today. So let's let's start from the assumption that we're cognitive agents, yeah? That seems like a reasonable assumption. We don't always act, of course, all humans are not cognitive agents all the time. I was asleep last night. I don't think I was doing anything particularly cognitive. When I was born, the moment I was born, I probably wasn't doing all that much impressive cognition, and presumably there'll be, if I'm lucky, I'll live to a very old age, and there'll be moments at the end of my life where I'm not doing much cognizing. But for much of our lives, we are cognitive agents. Is that a reasonable premise? Yeah? Okay. And let's also assume, I take it that some simulations of intelligence fail to be real intelligence. So we got Shaky up here. I didn't feel a whole lot of energy in the room arguing that Shaky is a full-blown intelligence. Does that sound accurate to you? Like, Shaky was simulating some aspects of intelligence, but it was just a simulation. Shaky wasn't a full-blown reasoner. Does that sound right? And if you're like, oh, Shaky's a reasoner, we can pick some less sophisticated simulation. Eliza wasn't a reasoner or something like that. Is that? Constantine's having none of it. What? No, you don't think it was?
If you say like some aspects, it's like just by that kind of determines like, okay, he's doing some aspects, that's some intelligence. Like, well, if he's got some things down on intelligence, right? Then aren't you kind of implying that on some level he is intelligent? Maybe not to the same degree that we are.
I don't think so. Just because, like, to be intelligent means to be sensitive to the meaning of the things that you're reasoning about, and I don't think Shaky was sensitive to the meaning of things he's reasoning about. That was the symbol grounding problem, that was that stuff. But yeah.
I was going to say Shaky's obviously rule governed.
He's obviously rule governed, yeah.
And those rules were instantiated by other people.
Right.
And the things it did were actual instructions and not things it produced within itself.
Right. For almost all of Shaky's existence, it was just following really like hard-coded programming provided by somebody else. So we shouldn't. Let's not get sucked back into the Shaky debate. It's a fascinating example to think about. But for our purposes, can we agree that there are simulations of intelligence that are not intelligent? Is that okay? Okay. So now we've got humans, definitely intelligence some of the time, on my good days. There are simulations that are definitely not intelligent, and now our job is to find some way of distinguishing the two. I've written on the slide a line. It strikes me now that it doesn't have to be a line, like a hard line, but we do need to figure out what the distinguishing factors are between the real thing and the fake thing, and I'll remind you why we want to do this. We want to do this because what we're interested in this class anyway, is strong AI, which is supposed to tell us about intelligence. So this matters to our scientific project. It's a question that's kind of unique to the way we're using artificial intelligence, and it's a question that matters to the success or failure of the use of AI as a tool to probe the question, what is a mind? So a lot hangs on this, and it's a kind of weird question. Okay. So, and what we're looking for is some similarity of kind. We want to say when is something like us in the sense of the same kind of thing as us. I'm going to use some of Jerry Fodor's ideas now. So Jerry Fodor points out that he's going to feature a lot in this lecture. Jerry Fodor points out that there's a really good kind of philosophical set of tools hanging around that we can use to distinguish when two things are the same kind of thing and when they're different kinds of things. It's a good old Leibnizian law of identity. So good old Leibniz had two rules for talking about when two things are identical and when two things are different. So we've got the identity of indiscernibles and the indiscernibility of identicals. So the identity of indiscernibles says two things are the same thing if you can't tell them apart. And the indiscernibility of identicals is if two things are the same thing, then you can't tell them apart. It's just it's the same idea, just backwards. Yeah? Okay, so I think the first one is the one that we're going to work with today. And we're going to work with a specific version of it. So So there's the strong version, which is not relevant to us. So two things are numerically identical if and only if they share all their properties. IFF is, by the way, philosophers speak for if and only if. We use that phrase often enough that we coined our own word for it. So two things are numerically identical. That is, they're literally the same thing if they share all of their properties. But of course, we're not interested in the question of like, am I literally the same thing as the robot I built? Nobody thinks that, right? I'm not literally like, so I am numerically identical with me. If you're going to count the number of me's in the room, you come up with 1, right? Not like, but we're interested in the categorical version. Two things are the same kind of thing if they share all of the relevant properties. So if you're going to say two things are identical in kind, what you should say is they're the same kind if they share all of the relevant properties. And that sticks us with the question, so alarm bells should be ringing in your head. That word, relevant, which is very often used to smuggle in subtle and sophisticated opinions that you don't want to say out loud or haven't thought through, right? And this is one of those examples. I'm not trying to smuggle it in, but it's relevant is a very complex. Relevant is a lot like context. You can do a lot with the word, but it's a lot of like implicit knowledge that you're bringing in, not saying out loud. So the question becomes, what are the relevant properties that we want to talk about we're sharing with machines in order to say that we're the same kind of thing, specifically intelligent things. Okay, so that's going to be the question for the rest of the class. How do we figure out what the relevant properties are that we either share or don't share? Let's now consider probably the most famous way of dealing with this, which is Alan Turing's way. Alan Turing gets to be on the British 50-pound note, by the way. It's their way of saying sorry for destroying his life for being homosexual after he saved the Allies in the war, World War II. Little late to say sorry for chemically castrating him and driving him to suicide, but you know, better late than never, I guess. Anyway, if you didn't know the tragic story of Alan Turing, The Imitation Game is a pretty good movie. It's not terrible. It's not super historically accurate, but it's also like the rough picture. Alan Turing created the very first computers that decoded the Nazi codes that helped the Allies win World War II. And then later in his life, it was discovered he's homosexual, and that was not allowed in the 50s in Britain. Anyway, so very clever person, laid the foundation for the philosophy of computation and modern computation. But he didn't have much interest in philosophy as such. His answer to this is probably, I mean, I really deeply feel, despite being a philosopher by training, I really deeply feel his perspective on this, which is, can we just not with the philosophy? Is that an option? Like, so he starts this paper, Computing and Machine Intelligence, from the question, can machines think? And he very sensibly breaks that down and says, look, that depends on what you mean by think and what you mean by machines. And the answer to those questions basically are answered by taking a poll. Like, you figure out what people mean by the word machine and figure out what the people mean by the word think, and that's your answer. But I don't care about that. He wasn't a very social person either. Who cares what people think what thinking is? That's not a deep answer. This question, can machines think, was supposed to be this deep metaphysical question about the nature of intelligence and the identity of rationality and all that stuff. You don't take a poll to answer a question like that. That's not how you answer that question. So it's just a bad question, he thinks. It's just not a well-formed question because we don't know what we mean by think. So maybe we can just not do the philosophy and do a practical test. And the practical test is essentially, it's what we currently understand as the Turing test. And it's like, look, if it looks like it's thinking, the end. I don't want to do any more philosophy than that. If you can't tell whether it's thinking or not, then it's thinking. Thanks everyone, good night. Right? It's an engineer's answer to this question. And it's got a lot of appeal. It's sort of very much caught on, and in some sense, that might be you might consider that just the end of the story. Look, if it looks like it's thinking, then it's thinking. Ta-da! Okay, everyone, that was the lecture for today. Good night. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so much more. Okay, so we're going to spend the rest of the day kind of picking on Turing. Unfortunately, we're gonna take a whole bunch of different thinkers, a series of different thinkers, trying to show why that's probably not going to be sufficient as an answer. Mostly because of this nasty little word, relevant, the relevant properties, and trying to figure out what that is in this case. I'd like to briefly, just as a kind of aside, almost an aside, but like, hands up if you've heard of the Turing Test. Yeah, like lots of people. Okay, so it's made it into the cultural consciousness. Yeah. It was in your readings. Yes, good. So all of you should have put up your hands because you've all done the readings, of course. But even outside of that, you probably have heard of it. Very few people seem to remember the original form that Turing presented it in because it's profoundly weird and uncomfortable. So let me make you uncomfortable for a minute because this is a very odd form of the test. So this is the quotes from this 1950s paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. So he says, instead of this like, can a machine think, here's a better question. Here's the practical question. And he says the new form can be described in terms of a game, which we will call the imitation game. It's played with 3 people, a man, A, a woman, B, and an interrogator, C, who could be at either sex. The interrogator stays in a room apart from the other 2. The object of the game for the interrogator is to determine which of the other 2 is a man and which is a woman. And then instead of a man and a woman, you insert a computer into one of the positions and say, now we ask the question, what will happen when a machine takes the part of A in the game? Will the interrogator decide wrongly as often when the game is played like this as he does when the game is played between a man and a woman? These questions replace our original, can machines think? That's really weird, isn't it? I don't think I could tell a man and a woman just from their discussions at all. Like, I don't know if I would, as interrogator, pass the Turing test in this case. I don't know. This is, so, does that weird you out as much as it weirds me out?
I think it made more sense at the time.
It might have made more sense in 1950s Britain when gender roles were incredibly strict. There's undoubtedly a very interesting PhD to be written on the intersection between Turing's private sexuality and this thought about gender. I'm not going to write that, but knock yourself out if you. It probably has already been written, actually. Yeah.
Is it a point to see if they guess it wrongly? So it's like
That's right. So that's right. So his proposal is a machine can pass this test if the rate at which the interrogator C guesses which one is man or woman is the same as the rate in which if it's a person behind the counter or behind the screen. Yeah.
Did he ever include, like, what if you were to, like, rotate people around where, like, man and woman switch places?
No. It wasn't very clearly articulated. Okay, so that's wildly weird and awkward, which is undoubtedly, in my mind, why we've historically forgotten all about this version of the test. Now if somebody says to you the Turing test, this is what they mean. Let me describe this to you. So a person C takes turn talking to A and B. After several rounds, C tries to guess who's the person and who's the computer. None of this very strange and awkward who's the man and who's the woman stuff. Yeah, so this is the Turing test as we currently understand it. There's an ongoing, I think it's currently ongoing, there's a prize for the first computer that can pass this on the regular. It's some tens of thousands of dollars. If you can write a program that can convince people that it's a person, you can win some substantial prize money. Yeah?
Doesn't a person also get awarded for being the most human?
Your award for being the most human is being human. Is being the best human you can be. It's an intrinsic reward. There's no money involved, I'm sorry.
Someone was given an award for that.
I don't. It would be. I mean, I agree. We should get cash money for being humans. We should just. It's hard work and it's very undervalued.
Like if you participate in the Turing Test
Oh, I see.
as one of the humans,
I see.
you get an award if you're the most convincing.
Or are you telling me that this is the way the prize money works? Or are you suggesting
I'm not
this?
sure if there's money, but there's people that get
Oh, oh.
the most human-like human.
The most human-like human. How do you judge that? You're greedy and small-minded. No. Okay. Okay. So, no, I love humans. I think we're great. The best thing we've got. So, okay. So, but also the worst. We're the best and the worst. That's us. So this is what they mean by the Turing test now, and you can see why. So the point of this test, the proposal, the deep philosophical proposal here, is that we don't worry about the philosophy, basically. Like, if you've seen philosophers go at a question like, what is thinking really, you'll find it pedantic and boring and picky, and they immediately lose track of the actual deep question and start like spinning off into replies to replies to replies. I love philosophers. They're great. We're great. But this is exactly what they do. So the philosophical question is traded in for a practical test. Like, if it does the things that you think intelligence should do, then it's intelligence, and don't bother me with this further question. There's no, and if you were, I mean, you know, if you think about how we use words and how words get their meaning, that makes a lot of sense. If you're not a Platonist about words, so Plato believed that words had these like, the forms of the words existed somehow independently of our minds, and our job is to remember them, right? So if you believe that words have meaning in some kind of transcendental, metaphysical, pre-specified sense, then it does make a lot of sense to like try to get at what the words mean really. But if you don't believe that, like most people don't believe that, most people believe, as I've quoted this already, but I just love this. In one of the latest Avenger movies, Thor says, all words are made up. And it's true, all words are made up. And we made up the meanings of them, so there's no point in like trying to chase down what does the word thinking mean really. There's a fact of the matter about how people use words, and that's the end of it, right? So maybe we don't have to do some deep philosophical stuff about what does thinking mean really. So lots of sympathy for this. On the other hand, we shouldn't allow ourselves to have a whole bunch of unquestioned assumptions that structure the way we see the world, should we? So that's the actual, like, maybe we don't need philosophers to dig down into what do you mean by thinking really, but a positive thing that the kind of thing that philosophers actually do is point out the things that you've been assuming that you didn't realize you were assuming. So here's some things that seem to be assumed by this test, the relevant things. For example, you're communicating with these two beings via typing. So all of the important parts of intelligence are communicable via written text. Maybe, so they're the kind of things you can do sitting down, stationary, indoors. This means that your dog is in no sense intelligent. A child is in no sense intelligent. A person with no hands can't prove that they're intelligent. Yeah.
You're pretty much limiting the test to almost like one mode of symbol manipulation.
Exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
That doesn't always apply to the rest of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. The capacity to read a room, irrelevant. Read facial expressions, or respond appropriately in social situations. Sing a song. Recite a poem with a pleasing rhythm. None of those things are allowed through the filter of this test. And therefore, none of those things are considered part of intelligence. The capacity to catch a ball. So Turing has, in some important sense, told us a lot, actually, about what he thinks thinking is. Despite explicitly rejecting the question, I don't want to worry about what I mean by thinking. he's actually told us quite a lot about it. And this fits a long-standing pattern of people who don't want to do philosophy, which is basically that your options are either to do philosophy or have an unexamined worldview. Like, you can either engage in the practice of trying to dig up your assumptions and think about them, or you can just ignore them and let them run you from the background. So Turing, by rejecting the idea that he has to think about what is thinking, what he's given us is just sort of an appealing package of assumptions about what thinking is, that he says, let's now proceed to not worry about those. So we might not have gotten it. And as much as I have sympathy for his kind of, I don't want to do philosophy perspective, I don't think he's gotten out of the questions. He's just gotten out of trying to seriously engage with them and answer them. Yeah.
This kind of gets back to like what you said like earlier, like how much do we need it to pass, how many things do we need to satisfy? Do we need an intelligent system to really be able to catch a ball versus like be able to sit in a box and communicate with things?
It's good. I mean, yeah. I mean, and I don't see any reason why we get to assume an answer one way or the other. I don't see why it's valid to just say, yeah, no, only the sitting down activities are involved in intelligence. Only the language manipulation activities are involved in intelligence. I don't see what the motivation there is. And it's a decision that matters. It matters to our scientific research program. Notice that it matters a lot in the debate between the GoFi people and the connectionists and the dynamical systems people. So the GoFi people would have said, yeah, this is good. This is what we're interested in. What we're interested in is our capacity to manipulate symbols. And the GoFi people were like, no, actually, reading handwriting is a pretty important sign of intelligence. The capacity to turn the complex waveforms coming out of my mouth into intelligible speech is a very important aspect of intelligence. And neither of those get to be included here. So what we've done is just encode a bunch of assumptions in a practical test and have them become invisible rather than explicitly argued for. Yeah. Okay. So for the rest of the lecture, we're just going to look at a bunch of people kind of questioning this and trying to draw out the parts that are important and all that stuff. I'm talking about the Turing test and what this test is doing. I forgot to make this connection back to the Leibniz stuff. So Leibniz says, when are two things identical? When they're indiscernible. And I hope this is clear that this is a case of doing exactly that kind of test. What we're saying is the robot and the person are identical in the sense of both being the same kind of thing, both intelligent agents, when they're indiscernible in terms of their intelligence. And then what matters here, the tricky bit is, of course, that we're dealing with two different versions of the indiscernibility of identicals, or the identity of indiscernibles, one of which is they share all their properties, and one of which is just they share their relevant properties. And what we've got is a kind of unexamined notion of what the relevant properties are. So let's move on to looking at some criticisms of this, look at people trying to sort of draw out these assumptions and critique them. Another slight historical aside, just to show you the spectacular arrogance of philosophers in general and Jerry Fodor in particular. He opens his book on psychological explanation with the following passage. He says, I think many philosophers secretly harbored the view that there's something deeply, i.e. conceptually, wrong with psychology, but that a philosopher with a little training in the techniques of linguistic analysis and a free afternoon could straighten it out. Several years ago, I found myself with a free afternoon. It's Jerry Fodor, ladies and gentlemen. This is the friendliest picture I could find of him. This is him looking his friendliest. Okay, so he's pretty sure he's sorted out the questions of psychology. One of the questions of psychology being, what makes something an intelligent agent? He changes his tune. We'll see by the end of this lecture. He softened it up a little bit in the intervening. Since 1968, he eased up a bit because he found that it wasn't quite an afternoon-long project. So the stuff that I've been saying about Turing is actually taken from Jerry Fodor. He is a very intelligent guy, like there's no question. So Fodor says, clearly Turing's made judgments about what's relevant to the question. All that stuff that we were saying before the break. The stuff that you can do while sitting down in front of a keyboard is what's relevant. Literally everything else in life is what's irrelevant. And I hope that that's not how you assess the relevance of your lives. It's not how I'm thinking about my life. And furthermore, it's not how I think about intelligence. Lots of intelligent activities involve skillful, dynamic, interactive activities that involve standing up or at least moving around. So the question is, how do you decide what's relevant to the test? So how do you sort the various properties into relevant or irrelevant? And Fodor thinks there's essentially two options. One, you could use your intuitions. You could just say, like, that feels important, and that doesn't feel important. You know, not very science-y. Philosophers end up relying on intuition a lot because we often don't have anything better to rely on. But it's a kind of disappointing situation to be in, isn't it? You don't want to be in a situation where you're just like, oh, well, that's what feels right to me. That's not really super convincing to anybody, right? So better than intuition, we would like to have some theoretical basis on which to separate the relevant from the irrelevant properties that we're going to include in our test. So suppose you were going to rewrite the Turing test. Suppose you look at the Turing test and you say, look, I don't think that just the stuff you can type is the right set of properties to test for. Say, okay, I agree with you that the thing to do is not to come up with like a really careful, explicit account of what does thinking mean, but to apply some sort of test. Now you're like, what sort of test should I write? And you can either just intuit your way through it, and I mean, that's a baseline from which you could move, but better it would be to have an explicit psychology, right? To have a theory of intelligence on which to decide which are the relevant and which are the irrelevant properties. But notice what that's done for us. That's landed us right back in the thing that Turing was hoping we could get out of, which is to have a theory about what thinking is. So Fodor's argument is basically, here are the only two options. One of them is kind of bad, and the other one is the one you're trying to avoid. So looks like we're stuck, this is the argument, or the conclusion of the argument, looks like we're stuck doing careful, thoughtful, explicit thinking about what thinking is. That's the claim. So he says, therefore we're unlikely to learn what thinking is from studying AI unless we already have a philosophical position about what thinking is. So quite apart from applying the Turing test, doing the AI project in general, Fodor thinks, isn't going to tell us what intelligence is unless you can tell when the machine is intelligent. So we had this debate about, is Shaky intelligent? And you think, well, how do you decide? Either you have intuitions or you have a theory. It seems to be the range of options. And just having more and more examples doesn't necessarily make you better and better at deciding. That's Fodor's claim. I should flag that I'm not actually in this lecture. In many of the lectures in this course, I'm explicitly I'm trying to convince you of some specific position. This lecture, I'm going to present a whole bunch of conflicting positions and not really come down on. I'm not trying to convince you of anything in particular. I just want you to know the back and forth of this argument. Yeah? Okay. So this is Fodor's claim. So to dig a little more deeply into this. So distinguish identity of competence and identity of performance. So for example, I'm recording this lecture, and I hope that you have at least some impression that this lecture is coming from an intelligent agent. More than 0% intelligent, yeah? Tiny, finite human level intelligence, but not zero, right? Now, the lecture is being recorded, and if you play it back, the computer that you're playing it on might not strike you as an intelligent agent. Nonetheless, they're generating identical performances, right? All of the sounds that I'm making are made by the computer. So the thing that maybe convinced you that the sounds you're hearing are coming from an intelligent agent, just the performance doesn't seem to be enough. One of the ways that you test whether I'm an intelligent agent is by asking questions, right? So you don't want to just know whether my performance is intelligent. You want to know whether I've got the competence to produce a bunch of different performances. So if you came back next year and I gave the exact same lecture, you might not be as convinced, right? If I only had one lecture and I just gave it over and over again, word for word for word, you might go, I don't know if this guy actually understands what he's saying, right? If this is just all an elaborate, like, if I don't actually, imagine I don't actually speak English and I've just memorized a whole bunch of English words in a row, and you ask me a question and I just cannot cope with it. That would be some evidence that I'm not understanding what I'm saying, right? It's not a performance of intelligence. Yeah.
There's actually, sorry, this is like,
Go ahead.
it's related to this, but like fun fact.
Sure. I love fun facts.
There's a band called Phoenix, and they made like a really hit song.
Yeah.
Very popular. I don't remember what name it is, unfortunately, at the moment. But they came from France.
Yeah.
And they weren't allowed to come into America, and they didn't know how to speak English, but they wrote the song in English. So what they did was they just learned, like, they pronounced everything phonetically.
Right. Yep.
To make it sound like English, but they had no idea what they were saying.
Yep. Yep. So they are imitating an English language speaker rather than have. So they have the right performance. They can perform English, but they don't have the competence in it. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah. So identity of output doesn't seem to be sufficient, right? You want something more like identity of competence. So now the question is identity of competence enough? So suppose you built a machine that has the same competence for generating words as I do. But now we've built a machine. It can produce words, strings of words. It can answer questions. If disturbed off of its performance, it can find a way back, that kind of thing. But suppose that we found out that it did it via radically different ways than we do it. Suppose that we looked into the parts of the machine and found that it was built out of just unbelievably different processes. So suppose it's got infinite computational power or infinite memory or something like that. Things that we pretty clearly don't have. Are we then willing to say that it's identical to us in the relevant way? Is it the same kind of thing that we are? And Fodor thinks, no. Fodor thinks that that's not, even identity of competence is not enough to attribute the identity of kind in this sense. Yeah?
Is there any other example other than infinites?
The one that strikes me is the difference in the ways that chess playing programs play chess versus humans play chess. So if you get a chess master to describe their process, they actually consider fewer possible moves than an amateur. So an amateur kind of just looks around and says like, oh, that looks good, that looks good, that looks good. A chess master, if they're reporting accurately how they work, they only consider just a few moves, but they're all awesome moves. They're like, I'm going to consider these 6 awesome moves and decide which one I want to make. Whereas the amateurs just kind of cast around. So that's the way that apparently expert chess players play. But a chess playing program considers millions of moves, or millions and millions of, like, huge numbers of moves. They explore large swaths of the tree. And of course they have algorithms or heuristics to narrow down the space that they explore, but the number of possible moves they explore is massive. So what you don't want to say is, now I understand how humans play chess because I looked at Deep Blue and saw how it worked. Well, that's an old reference, but I hope it's still current enough to remember. Chess playing, you don't look at how chess playing programs work and go, that's how we work. Because we know that it's just not possible for a human to explore millions and millions of moves a second. That's just not how we could possibly work. Yeah.
If suppose humans could look at millions of possibilities at once, would you then say that humans aren't intelligent anymore?
No. Okay, interesting. So suppose we could look at millions. Suppose that is how we did it. What then? So what should we say then?
Yeah, I'm just saying maybe having more processing power, be able to look at a wide range of things, isn't a limiting factor
Right.
on intelligence.
Okay, good. Good. Okay, I agree. Oh, okay. So on this, it's maybe not. So it doesn't disqualify it as intelligent. Like if somebody came to me and said, no, actually, I do consider millions of possibilities, and I had reason to believe them, I'd be like, wow, you're really intelligent. But what you should conclude then is that it's not the same type of. What we can't do is the strong AI project. We're trying to learn about ourselves by building these things. It's kind of egocentric and narcissistic, but like we want to know about us. My favorite topic, me. I want to learn about me. So, given that these computer programs are doing something that we clearly can't do, what that tells us is that we can't use this AI to learn about ourselves, or how we are intelligent. But that's an interesting thought. Like, maybe that's not disqualifying for understanding intelligence in general. Maybe that's just like, well, humans kind of are bad at thinking. Yeah.
Getting back to kind of the horsepower of our brains, like, do we necessarily have to be aware that we are considering millions of things?
No, yeah,
We
that's right.
want to be, okay, we kind of think that we consider the seven things, but really our brains are massively like just probing the search space, hitting it with everything it's got.
Maybe there's no, as far as I know, there's no evidence of that, but yeah, it's possible. That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Two questions.
Yeah.
First, are you judging intelligence by the processes by which you go about or the output? And then second, this reminds me of like the search space model where it was just like, do you look at the whole thing and then zoom in on what you want, which is your answer. But like, let's say a machine has, going back to the chess example, if a machine goes through 100,000 options,
Yep.
but it's more intelligent to go through the 6 relevant choices that you have, then how do you judge intelligence?
Good. So I mean, your first question is precisely the question that we're kind of grappling with. That's like and I don't propose that I have the answer, but like what we know is that if what we wanted of building an artificial intelligence is to learn about ourselves, then it has to be something about just the performance isn't enough. And Fodor wants us to think that even the ability to produce different answers isn't enough. It's got to be the same internal process. That's the conclusion that he's going to come to, is that it's got to be something like they're using the same methods as we are to get their answer. If that's what you want out of AI is to learn about us, then it has to be the same methods of generation. And yeah, so it's very similar to the search space thing where, the computer program is still limited by like, you can't do an infinite search, but it seems to be exploring search spaces in a different way than we are. Yeah, and it would be in some sense, in the sense of intelligence that I've been kind of trying to sell you in this course, where intelligence is ignoring the irrelevant stuff and focusing in on the irrelevant stuff. I think the chess master is in some sense much more intelligent than the computer that just searches through the whole space. That's the kind of sense I've been trying to generate anyway. Sorry, yeah.
Could you make like a Venn diagram of the chess playing program versus the person, and you would have on one side kind of the things that the chess machine could do. So it could go through millions of different possibilities through this machine versus a person wouldn't be able to do that. But there are similarities between what the two agents are do, if I can call it the chess playing machine an agent. But they're both going through possibilities.
Yep.
They're both simulating potential outcomes.
Yep.
Right? And so you could say that in the center is what intelligence is, what's a common. And what is outside of that would just be like, that's it's something different. And in that way, you would kind of figure out what, like, because it might be that some of the interesting characteristics of us, the things that we can do, realize like relevance through large search spaces of possibilities. That might not be intelligence, that might be something else. Right? And so, I don't know
Right. So that's very much in line with the story I pitched you at the beginning of this lecture, which is like what we wanted of AI is to have it be similar to us in some way and different, and we extract the commonalities. Yeah. So, yeah, that's very interesting, and it does point to the fact that we should probably be more open-minded than Fodor's being here about what counts as intelligence, because something could be radically different than us and still be intelligent. So if what we want to understand is intelligence in general, then maybe having infinite memory doesn't disqualify you from being intelligent. It just makes you intelligent in a different way or something like that. Yeah, it's very interesting. I likewise hesitate to call a chess playing program intelligent or an agent, mostly because we know that they're not general intelligences. So if if you had a general problem solver that did it the way a chess program does it, then you might be in a position where you have to say like, look, we just have to broaden what we think intelligence is. Yeah, that's good. That's interesting. Yeah.
Kind of coming back to some of the psychology studies that we saw, like people don't appear to always be conscious or aware of what they consider as relevant. Like,
Totally.
Like
Yep.
Relevancy, like
Yeah.
someone's categorization is unstable.
Yep.
So I'm kind of making the claim that like yes, I only consider some things in my head. Again, going back to the parallelization problem, like
Yep.
you're going to make claims about binary predicament, images, processing power, stuff like that. You're doing that from the perspective of what you are aware of, completely
Yep.
ignoring a lot of the evidence. Like yes, it seems that I consider things that I'm not necessarily aware of, and they do kind of factor into my decisions.
Yeah, that's true.
Seems like a big trap to be saying like, okay, this is my mental process. I just gotta replicate this. This is what takes me as long as the machine.
Yeah. No, okay. So it's a good point. We shouldn't say we know for sure that we're not doing a bunch of stuff unconsciously. I'm just sort of like, I don't see any evidence for that view. And most of what we know about human problem solving suggests that we do it in a way that operates with limited computational capacities. So given the evidence we have, we look like we can only do so much processing, and there's no evidence that we can do huge amounts of unconscious processing. So the preponderance of evidence suggests that we're not doing what the chess program does. That could be overthrown if we learn more about the mind. We absolutely could.
People make categorizations, for instance, like when you're doing like linear matching categorization for things that are equally similar to one thing, but then like dissimilar to each other by varying lengths.
Mm-hmm.
And like they're not aware of that. They're just kind of like answering questions. They're not like mental reasoning. Okay, this
Yeah.
has X, Y, Z characteristics, blah 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 numerical value, and I chart it all out in my head. Like I'm not doing that.
Right.
There's clearly some underlying computation going on that must be more complex.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, so Freud was wrong about almost everything. The one thing that seems to be absolutely borne out by modern psychology is most of what happens in your mind is unconscious. Yeah. Okay, let's not get bogged down in this because it's a debate we've had a bunch of times already, and it's sort of not relevant to what we're doing right now, yeah? Okay. So, Fodor is going to conclude from these arguments. So his argument was, just to review, his argument was, look, identity of performance is not enough because you're not going to look at your MP3 player. That's a dated reference, but you're not going to look at your MP3 player delivering a podcast and be like, wow, this MP3 player knows a whole lot about the Syrian civil war. Like that's not how we judge intelligence, not just by performance, right? We don't even want to judge it by competence, he claims, because competence doesn't tell you that you've got the same processes going on. Now we've heard some arguments that like maybe that's not. So we've had some interesting pushback against that claim. So maybe you don't want to follow him there. But if you suppose that that's right, he's going to conclude that what we need is identity of process, and he's going to smile his evil go-fi smile and say what you need is formal equivalence. That's going to be his conclusion, that if you're going to build something that's intelligent, that we can genuinely say is intelligent, you need it to be formally equivalent to what our mind does. So that's Fodor in 1968. Right. And that's his conclusion from doing this analysis of the Turing test. His conclusion is, look, the Turing test is not nearly sufficient to say that something is intelligent. What you need is something vastly stronger, which is formal equivalence, in the sense that we talked about before. Okay, let's visit a somewhat humbled Jerry Fodor from 23 years later, who says the following. In a sense, I do believe that the whole enterprise of GoFi is ill-founded. Not because it's got the wrong picture of the mind, however. It's not that humble. But because it has a bad methodology for turning that picture into science. I don't think you do the science of complex phenomena by attempting to model gross observable variance. Physics, for example, is not an attempt to construct a machine that would be indistinguishable from the real world for the whole length of a conversation. We do not think of Disneyland as a major scientific achievement. So simulating the world isn't the point of science, according to Fodor. But he is willing to admit that the GoFi thing didn't pan out. By 1991, Jerry Fodor was a little bit, he calmed down a little bit. His confidence his personal confidence remained at an all-time high, but like his confidence in the GoFi project. And it was largely because of the frame problem stuff, actually. It was largely because of the stuff that we talked about already, where a rule-based computer seems like a really bad structure to do context-sensitive reasoning, and context-sensitive reasoning seems to be one of the best things that we do. So, okay. So, let's look at this paper by Christopher Green from 1996. This is one of your readings, by the way, and I've simply put it in the wrong place in the syllabus. I just noticed this morning. This is a reading from like a couple weeks from now, and it's just ill-placed in the syllabus, so I guess don't worry about it. Chris Green's paper, Fodor Functions Physics and Fantasyland, Is AI a Mickey Mouse Discipline? Sort of picks up on this notion. So he's picking specifically on this quote from Fodor, saying, when he says, we do not think of Disneyland as a major scientific achievement. So that is, we shouldn't just be in the business of trying to create something that looks like what we're interested in, right? You don't understand the world by building a Disneyland. And Green is going to kind of think about this a little. He says, well, all right. Why is that? What's up with that? So he argues that, Green argues that AI is unlikely to tell us what intelligence is unless we already have a robust psychological theory of intelligence. So basically going to agree with Fodor in his conclusion, but offer us some different reasons, some different perspectives on why. So again, we're still picking on poor Alan Turing. We're still saying, well, you know what, this Turing test probably not going to be enough. And furthermore, the whole AI project, the point of both of these papers is going to be, you can't engineer your way out of a philosophy problem. That the philosophical question of what is a mind, you need some independent way of getting at it. You need some theoretical way of getting at it that's not going to be answered just by building AIs. Okay, so what does he say in this paper? So first he wants to note a couple things about Disneyland. I hope I'm not crushing anybody's childhood fantasies by telling you that most of what happens at Disneyland, you didn't actually meet a giant mouse. Most of what happens at Disneyland isn't real. There's real hot dogs and they really take your money and all that stuff. So that part's real. But maybe it's not the best metaphor for thinking about this stuff. So it's not a real, in Disneyland, they're not trying to convince you that you're in a magical kingdom for real. They are just trying to create a fanciful experience for you that you can enjoy with your family. I promise I'm not getting kickbacks from Disney. So maybe we need to think about something more like Westworld. When Chris Green was writing this, Westworld was a sci-fi movie from the 70s. Now it's an HBO original, I think. So there's a remake series of it. And the point of Westworld is it's supposed to be a completely accurate simulation of an Old West village. Is that right? I haven't actually seen this thing. Yeah.
It's like a theme park, and each section is a medieval section.
Thank you. Okay.
Kind of like Disney.
Okay. So it's like a Disney World, except each of the parks is supposed to be like very, very convincing. It's supposed to be accurate down to the details. Yeah. Okay. So Westworld, much better version of this to be thinking about. So why is it that we don't consider Westworld a deep scientific achievement? Green has us suppose the following. So imagine this. So imagine you dug into the ground in Westworld and found that there was these huge pistons that caused earthquakes. His question is, why don't you then conclude that earthquakes are caused in general by huge pistons? And remember the conclusion that he's coming to. So he wants to convince us that you need a theoretical account of intelligence in order to understand intelligence. You can't just build one and go, ah, there we go. Well, it's because you have a theory of earthquakes, isn't it? Right? You have this understanding of earthquakes as caused by tectonic shifts in geology and stuff, right? If you were a Paleolithic person and you were living in Westworld, you had no notion of what earthquakes are, you might actually be reasonably justified in you dig down. So you have your Grodd, the Neolithic human. You have no notion of science or whatever. You dig down, you find these huge pistons causing earthquakes. You might actually be really well justified in thinking, yeah, pistons cause earthquakes.
I guess my problem with this is like, if you built a big enough piston, or you got an atomic bomb or something like that, and you sunk it deep down into the earth and blew it up, you could make an earthquake. Like,
So,
like an earthquake, like the idea or the notion.
okay, but the earthquakes in general are not caused by pistons, right? We agree on that?
I'm kind of getting to the point.
Okay.
It's adaptable, like what your definition of like earthquake is. Like, is it caused by tectonic plates, or is it a shifting of just land matter? Like,
Right.
what is?
Yeah. Is this?
Yeah, I'm just confused about. So, are you saying you're confused as to why we're not convinced that pistons are what causes earthquakes?
Well, okay, so it's about the justification of beliefs. So,
That's pretty clear that we don't believe that pistons cause earthquakes.
right,
Yes.
right.
I don't know.
Well,
Unless you would.
okay.
Oh, I see.
In general, it's not the case that pistons cause earthquakes, right?
Right.
Okay, so the natural explanation that we have of actually all of the earthquakes that have ever happened has been either natural tectonic. You know what? In '96, this was true that it was all natural. Now it's fracking. So fracking does, okay, but it's not pistons and it's not big bombs, right? And even if you were living in Westworld, if you'd raised there your whole life, so you would dig down, if you had access to some textbooks, dig down to the ground, you find some pistons, you'd be like, no, that's not what causes earthquakes. These are fake earthquakes. And we shouldn't understand how earthquakes in general work based on what's going on in Westworld. And we do that because we have a pre-existing theory of earthquakes. So it's the theory doing the work. We're willing to overturn our observations because we have the theory. And the analogy is supposed to be with AI. Look, how do we distinguish what's real intelligence from what's just a simulation? These are simulated earthquakes. The real earthquakes are caused by this thing, and we know that because we have a theory of earthquakes. Similarly, you need a theory to distinguish the real intelligence from the fake intelligence. Yeah?
Okay, what if a person lived on some fake mechanical planet or something? All the earthquakes were actually caused by pistons or some other form like a bomb. And then that person reads about earthquakes from actual Earth.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that just be fiction to them?
Interesting. Yeah, so I take a concept. This is similar to what you're. So what's real and what's simulated is dependent on what's generally true in your world, right? So the point of science, recall, is to extract the generalities from the world. And the point of the scenario is that the pistons thing is just like, it's just in this one theme park, right? So you don't build science based on what's going on in a theme park. Similarly, you don't build science based on your simulations. You build science based on what's in the world in general. Yeah.
Kind of getting back to psychology, like the idea of like the artifact and the natural.
Yeah.
It seems kind of like in the space of like, am I building a theory for like when is it an artifact? Like, is it a fake apple? Am I just considering apple-like objects? Is this a real apple, fake apple? How realistic is my fake? Like, the context of
That's, yeah.
the earthquake seems to change depending on like my notion of like what is relevant to me. In fact, is the land just shaking? Okay, I'm not going to dig down and determine that the tectonic plate shifted versus line collapsing or something. That's a big problem for this.
I don't think it is. I don't think it is. Because in general, earthquakes are caused by geology, not pistons. And don't argue with me on that. That's just a fact about reality, right? There are no piston-caused earthquakes in the real world. This is a made-up example. So a sound theory of earthquakes is a geological theory. Okay. So if you want to understand earthquakes, we have a theory of earthquakes that lets us tell which are the real ones and which are simulated earthquakes. Okay. We can argue about this more later, but let's keep going for now. The conclusion is that what we need is a paradigm for cognitive science. If we're going to figure out which artificial beings are genuinely intelligent and which are just simulating intelligence, it's not enough to have a long chat with them and see if you get fooled. It's not enough to do a practical test. You need a theoretical structure. And I think this is consonant with everything you're saying, Constantine. You still need a theory. Even if the theory of earthquake, even if you disagree with the theory of earthquakes I'm presenting, you still need a theory at some level in order to make this distinction. That's the whole point of this argument. That it's some kind of paradigm. And a paradigm, recall, involves, we talked about this at the very beginning of the course, it involves an ontology, that is a list of things that you think really exist. It involves a methodology, a list of methods that you think are legitimate. It involves an epistemology, a view of what you think counts as good evidence and all that stuff. And sadly, that's what we don't have in cognitive science right now. We're still missing a paradigm, a full-blown paradigm. So, hopefully we'll get one together. I don't know. Okay, let's do another one. Let's do another argument, another perspective on this stuff. So Dan Chiappi and Andrei Kukla give us the following argument, which is very skeptical. They argue that we're never going to be able to come up with what they call a criterion for the cognitive, and that's related to the stuff about paradigms. So a paradigm would give you a criterion for what counts as cognition, a criterion of the cognitive. And they say that we're never going to do it because the mind is more like white things than horses. Okay, so horses have the following property. If you investigate one of them, you're very likely to learn about the others. You count the legs on one of them, it's going to give you good statistical evidence about how many legs the others are going to have. You investigate their nervous system or how their respiratory system works or their internal organs. You look at their behavior. It's a good chance, I mean not guaranteed by any means, but there's a good chance that you're going to be able to generalize your observations. Now this is a really nice property for something to have. And it's a property that's shared across almost everything that you can do a science about has this property. That is, you study one sample and then it gives you information about all of the other things that fall under that class. If you measure the conductivity of gold, if you measure the malleability of steel, if you measure the refractive index of a liquid, right? You're not just learning about that specific thing right in front of you. You're learning about the class of things, which is lovely. That's what you want. You want to extract the generalities from the world. Now compare horses with white things. Are there any general other than being white and different ways of saying that, are there anything that's shared amongst all white things? Say, look, here's a white thing. It's flat and kind of floppy. Therefore, white things in general are flat and kind of floppy. No, right? Right? So this is not a category about which we get good export, right? You don't get to just make observations about white things and go, all of them are going to be like this. Unlike horses, where there's a decent chance, like you've got a good chance of being able to generalize about them. So what you need, for anything, if you're going to make a science about it, what you need is this systematic, they call it systematic import, which is just the same as saying generalizability. That is, if you study one of the things, you get to learn about all the other instances of it. Yeah.
Those things don't really seem fair to compare in that a horse is a far more specific thing than like white things, for example.
Oh yeah, there's that.
And you could say about like white things, like all white things reflect every other color except the color white.
But that's just to say that they're white.
But I mean, if you were to say compare living things with white things, you would suffer the exact same problem. Horses themselves are a more specific example.
I think you can actually say some things about living things in general. So for example, they need to take in energy and export waste. They need to construct their own parts. They need to establish a semi-permeable membrane between themselves and the environment. So there are some characteristics of life in general.
Okay, but I mean, we could go back to the first section of the class.
Yep.
Those two categories of things could share infinite. They have infinite
It's true.
limits, right? So this
Yep.
I feel like that example, like those two examples, don't really
Okay.
support the need for a systematic.
How about this one? How about this one? And so compare horses with things that happen on a Tuesday. There's no science of things that happen on a Tuesday, right? Because there's not anything holding that category. So think back to categories and sets. White things is a set. It's a fine set. Things that happen on Tuesdays, it's a set. They're not really categories as such because you don't get the, and we can admit kind of gradations between these. There could be looser and tighter categories. So I think the category of gold is a very good category. Like if you know something is a sample of pure gold, you know a lot about it, Whereas horses, there's lots of variation within that category. You don't, learning about one specific horse doesn't necessarily tell you about a different horse, but nonetheless, you get pretty good export. And then white things seems to be way on the other end of look, there's just nothing systematic about this. Does that seem fair?
I mean,
and I don't think it hangs on the specificity.
I don't agree.
That's okay.
There's a number of different, if you were to even use the example of Tuesday.
Yep.
Well, it's a day. I mean, theoretically, it's 24 hours.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
You could come up with a list of things that, the abstract category of Tuesday, you could fit onto every Tuesday, right? The word even Tuesday itself is spelled with a T. There's.
Yeah. Well, but events that take place on a Tuesday.
Yeah. Well,
How about events that take place on Mars on a Tuesday? It's very specific, but I don't think there's anything that hangs together in that category. Sir? Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
I just want to clarify. So the point that you're trying to get across is that the idea with comparing forces, which is something that we can take, we can extract information from
Yeah.
a systematic way.
Yeah.
It's not the same thing as if we try to deal with that with any other category or any other subject that doesn't have that same problem. We need to extract information.
That's right. So right now I'm just trying to distinguish two types of classes of things. Classes where you get systematic import, classes where you're if I learn about one member of this category, I learn about the other members, and scenarios where there's not that. So if you agree that there's those two types of categories, then we're good for now, yeah? Do you agree that there are categories that aren't really good categories for doing science? Okay. It's okay to disagree, but let's keep going because we got to get through this stuff. So I'm very happy to talk more about this later. Yeah. Sorry, Constantine, do you have a quick thing? Okay. Okay, let me get to the point of this so that we don't absolutely lose track of where we are and what's going on. Their claim is that cognition is more like white things than horses. And their argument is the following. The thing that makes horses a good category, the thing that gives us systematic import, is that there are context-insensitive features of it. I mean, naturally, horses are kind of tricky because it's biological and there's a lot of variation inside them. But like, think about gold, think about hydrogen, right? Hydrogen's got the properties that it's got regardless of where it is in the universe, regardless of when it is in the universe, in a very context-insensitive way, right? That's the nice thing about it, and that's why you can study one piece of hydrogen over here and learn about other hydrogen over there. Context insensitivity. Now, what is it that I've been trying to sell you on as the key feature of human-level cognition? Context sensitivity. As we are not just rule-following machines, we are machines that are able to decide which rules to follow and when. When to break the rules, when to make new rules. That seems to be what characterizes higher cognition. All that stuff about the frame problem, that was part of it. So this paper's called Context Selection and the Frame Problem. The very nature of higher cognition seems to be a kind of context sensitivity. Therefore, the claim goes, you don't get to have a science about higher cognition because it's the kind of thing that doesn't have context-insensitive properties. Ta-da. It's an annoying argument, isn't it? Now, if that argument is true, this whole project is doomed. The whole thing. We can all go home and not try to do this anymore. So I hope that this argument doesn't work. I'll give you an argument later that it doesn't work. Again, I'm really not trying to sell you on any of these arguments today. I'm just trying to like go through them and show you the range of opinions and stuff like that. So if this works, cognitive science and possibly much of psychology is a doomed project. And they're doing it precisely based on the stuff that I've been really emphasizing in this course about like, what is intelligence really? No. This is an argument that we are what's called epistemically bounded. So epistemic boundedness is the idea that a mind is epistemically bounded if it's incapable of generating the concepts and categories it needs in order to explain itself. And that's a thing that you could legitimately think, and lots of people legitimately think this, that look, we're just never gonna understand ourselves. And if you look at most animals, like I'm sorry, your dog's never gonna get calculus. You train it all you want, it's never gonna understand that. It's just not gonna happen for it. It's a good dog, it's a good boy, but it's not gonna get calculus, right? So we're happy to attribute epistemic boundedness to every other species on the planet, and then we get a little uncomfortable when it's us. We're like, no, but I'm great. Didn't I tell you that I'm awesome? I'm awesome, you guys. Okay.
Also kind of the same if I say like we are consciousness, like or that we are conscious, I guess to a degree.
No.
Sure, a dog won't understand calculus.
No.
The dog is aware of its own being to a degree. Like it knows that it's perfect.
It's not a claim that we're not conscious. It's just a claim that we're never going to be in a position to understand ourselves. That's the claim. Well, to some degree, but not fully. Sorry, I saw your hand first. Yeah.
But that dog can't understand calculus because it doesn't have the machinery to do it.
Right.
But here, is it because we don't have machinery or because we don't answer?
The claim is, okay, so there's two different ways that we could be epistemically bounded. One is that it's just not the kind of thing that science can do, and the other is that we just don't have the machinery. So those are two ways of getting at the same conclusion. And it's, the horses and paper thing was one of those, and those other people think that we just don't have the hardware. Yeah?
I don't see how this is that different from Kant saying you can't have a science of biology. I don't see this as like really that well founded in stuff that we I don't see why that's not as fallacious as Kant saying biology just isn't a science that we can't do.
Yeah. Well, okay, so it's what we need is some response to this argument, right? The horses and white things argument, right? And maybe not coincidentally, the answer I'm going to pitch to you, and I'm not saying it's the right answer, but it's the one that I have to pitch to you, is very similar to the one that is the answer to Kant. So the answer to Kant, why can't we have a science of biology, was something like Darwin. We say like, look, we can make systematic explanations about why living things are the way they are. And the way that we do it is not by, so Darwin's explanation doesn't specify what fitness is, what is fit, right? So Darwin doesn't say, you know what, the animal that jumps the furthest and has the sharpest teeth is the one that's going to survive. That's just not the structure of Darwinian theory. So he doesn't pre-specify what makes an animal fit. What he does is say, here are the forces that are dynamically shaping species. Natural selection, mutation, and a bunch of, I mean, since Darwin, we've come up with a bunch of other things that sort of help to shape species. So he's, instead of trying to say what fitness is, what properties make something fit, Darwin says, here are the dynamic constraints that shape how fitness changes over time. So maybe the form of our theory about higher cognition should be the same form. In some sense, the GoFi project was trying to pre-specify what's relevant. You try to program into the computer what's important. And maybe that's just like trying to pre-specify what fitness is. Instead of trying to say, here are the things that are relevant, what we should be doing is saying, here's my theory about the dynamic forces, the dynamic constraints that change how we make relevance judgments over time. So instead of saying what's relevant, we say how we fit ourselves to our environment to assess what's relevant. So this argument seems to assume that the job of understanding higher cognitive functions is to find some pre-specified set of properties that an intelligent agent has. Whereas maybe it's rather to describe, maybe the job of a theory of cognition is rather to describe the ways that various interplays of constraints bring about intelligence. So it's a kind of difference in the level of theory. I'm sorry if that was a bit vague and confusing. We'll come back to this at the end of the course where I'll do this in much more deep detail, if that's okay. Okay, so talking about epistemic boundedness, the possibility that we should all give up and go home. I mean, we should go home eventually, but maybe not give up. Here's another line of thought. So here's Harnad giving his strategy for how to deal with this stuff. So no, maybe here's the way to do it, is we lay out a scale of Turing tests. So unclear what the Turing test should include. So here's a strategy. We'll lay out a scale of really easy ones to really hard ones, and then just sort of like do a hot and cold test to figure out what the right level is. So we should consider a bunch of different ones and then just find in that scale where the best one is. So okay, let's do it. So he's got T1 to T4 or 5. So here's T1, here's the easiest one. Toy modeling, so the weakest form of the Turing test is where you give the agent simple, minimal tasks and see if they can do those simple, minimal tasks. So this is shaky. This is classic shaky stuff, right? So shaky, we're just saying, go to this location. Shaky goes to that location. It's probably not enough, right? Probably too weak of a Turing test to be the robust one that we want, yeah? Okay. All right, so too weak, we need to go a little bit stronger. How about T2? This is the standard Turing test. And not the weird one that Turing laid out, the one that history remembers because it's less socially awkward. Harnad thinks this fails because of Searle's Chinese room argument, which I'm going to go off on a tangent about right now. So John Searle wrote this a long time ago. It's also kind of, hands up if you've encountered this before, Chinese room argument. Fewer of you than the Turing test. Okay, so this one, this is it's a good one to have in your cultural reference repertoire. So the thought experiment goes something like this, and it's a thought experiment that's supposed to show you that mere symbol manipulation can never equal intelligence. So imagine there's a person living in a room, And all that's in the room is a very elaborate book or set of books with rules for taking one symbol and then you say, okay, if you see this symbol, then you write down this symbol. And then people, native Chinese speakers, write things down and put it through a slot. And this man in the room has no understanding whatsoever of the Chinese language, has no idea what the symbols mean. He's just totally ignorant of their actual meaning. He receives these things, looks them up in his book, and then sees, okay, the book says, if I see this symbol, I write down this symbol, and then he puts them through another slot. And from the perspective of the people outside of the room, it looks like what he's doing is receiving messages and giving perfectly sensible replies. Okay. So by assumption, the responses he gives are like fully human-level intelligent responses. So we're assuming this is a really good book that he's got in there. That's a tricky assumption to make, but it's the assumption that his opponents are making. So he's allowed to help himself to this. So the intuition that you're supposed to have about this, the intuition that Searle's trying to get you to have, is that there's no understanding going on here, right? It's just, despite the fact that it's passing the Turing test. This is exactly the Turing test, right? So symbols come in, symbols go out. For the people on the outside, it's a perfectly reasonable conversation, but there's no understanding. He wants you to think there's no understanding happening. Yeah?
Wouldn't the, like, I guess the antithesis does almost be like the mechanical Turk, where you do have an intelligent system inside it, and you think it's dumb. You
Yep.
think this is just a mechanical thing, but there is an intelligent thing behind
Yep.
it.
So this is like the opposite of a mechanical Turk.
This would be like the opposite.
Yep.
This flies in the face of that thing.
Yeah, it's just the inverse. Yeah.
Couldn't it also be argued that this is kind of by definition unintelligent components making an intelligent system? This is where you get that sort of base layer of that emergent property of consciousness emerging.
Well, now you're not cooperating with Searle because he wants you to not think that. So, I mean, you've defeated him by just not agreeing. That's the trouble with a thought experiment, is that it assumes that your intuitions will go one way, and if they don't, you've defeated the thought experiment. Yeah.
So let's assume that this rule book that
Yeah.
the person, the man in the room is reading, couldn't you just assume that understanding actually is happening? The rules that exist within that book are intelligent because they're able to take an input and provide a perfectly coherent response. It's you just took the, if you had a native Chinese speaker, that would do exactly what that rule book would do. Then the rule book is where the understanding is occurring.
Well, it can't be the book itself that's doing the understanding, because it still needs somebody to do the manipulations, right? It's not that the book understands. The book is just like some ink on paper. It's more like the system as a whole understands.
Yeah.
Okay, that would be what's called the system reply. So this is good. You're ahead of you would have been a famous philosopher in the 70s. Okay. So maybe the room as a whole understands. And now Searle's got a response. Actually, his response is in the original paper. He says, okay, so now just imagine the person memorizes the rules. So this person, instead of having a book, they just memorize the rules and they learn how to receive a piece of paper and write down an appropriate response, but they still have no ability to understand the symbols. Would we now say that they understand Chinese language? Yeah.
I was gonna say, like, if I'm playing checkers, I usually memorize the rules, or if I'm playing a game, I try to memorize the rules. To have that kind of response, are you saying that I don't understand checkers, or that I don't understand
Well,
chess?
in
Rules are not quite.
yeah, but that's the rules don't tell you what move to make. They just tell you what moves you're allowed to make. Here, the rules are just the whole story. Yeah.
So maybe I'm just not, like, maybe I just don't think that language, like, you can do this, but
Yeah.
if it would pass the Turing test, doesn't that have to imply some amount of intelligent response to, or does it just make the same things every time and assume that the person just doesn't know? Like, does it have to have some sort of way to make it so that the rules incorporate some sort of intelligent decision-making process? Because that does happen with conversations that manage to trick humans into.
It's unclear. So, because what Searle is responding to is the GoFi tradition. Searle is trying to show that the GoFi tradition can't be right, and the GoFi people tell us that they can build exactly this kind of book. It's in a digital computer, but their whole project was, I'm going to write you a set of rules that let you take in symbols and by purely formal, unintelligent symbol manipulation, generate responses that look intelligent. So that's their whole claim. The people he's trying to show are wrong. Their whole claim is, I can build you such a book. And Searle says, well, look, if it's just manipulating the symbols without understanding them, then it's not really intelligent. That's the trap he's trying to get you in. And if your intuition, so your initial intuition was, yeah, but that's intelligent, then you've just defeated the thought experiment. You're just not agreeing with the way he's hoping that your intuition's gonna scream at you, no, there's no understanding here. But if you're like, nah, it understands, then you win. Well, yeah.
The book is like a finite set of rules
Yeah.
that can deal with infinite amount of scenarios or like an infinite amount of conversations,
Hmm?
including like new things that perhaps the book didn't like originally account for.
Mhm.
And wouldn't that be intelligent?
I mean,
Because like, are we assuming the book is infinite in its amount of rules?
he really doesn't, again, because the people that he's arguing against think that they can come up with such a set of rules, he doesn't really have to answer these questions for his argument to do its thing. So he has to assume that it's finite, it can't be completely, the book can't be infinite, but because the people who he's arguing with are saying like, look, I can give you a set of rules that generate intelligence, he's not really responsible for giving us those details. I don't think you can write such a book. I think that's an impossible book. It's not a book you can make. His argument doesn't even derail by that. He's perfectly happy to say, yeah, that's impossible, but even if it was possible, it wouldn't be an instance of intelligence because it's unintelligent symbol manipulation. It's symbol manipulation without understanding. This gets back to the symbol grounding problem, the problem of how do you get meaning into the symbols if all of the manipulations are purely formal. Yeah?
Kind of getting into meaning as well as the game example again, like
Sorry, I can't hear you.
kind of getting into meaning in the game example that I used again, like if I memorize the rules, I can, if I'm bored enough, sit at my computer and program an AI that will try to maximize and use those rules to win the game.
Uh-huh.
I can use those memorized rules to come up with a strategy to win.
Uh-huh.
But that strategy could also just be described in the rule. Like if it's a really simple game, just do whatever you need to do to maximize your score and minimize your loss to the opponent while following these set of rules, play the game. Then it has everything it needs to play the game, as well as the formal rules of that game and how to win the game as well.
Right.
It doesn't need anything else. It can achieve everything.
And then what?
It's satisfying the requirement of playing the game and reasoning. Like if you adapted this as just like, okay, Searle's Chinese room,
Okay.
the chess playing experiment, it's
Okay.
being intelligent. Like,
Okay, yeah, so it's acting. So where is the intelligence though? I mean,
I don't know.
Okay, let's go through some more. Let's keep going because I know that we're straining everybody's cognitive resources. So a couple more replies. I think Searle actually does this also in his original thing. So like maybe the problem is that this thing is stationary and that's why you want to. So a few of you are being like, no, I think this thing is intelligent. And if that's what you think, then Searle's argument just has no purchase on you. Searle's argument just is not working on you. The only way that this argument has force is if your intuitions are telling you, look, I don't think this is intelligent. So his replies are to people he's trying to just generate that. He's trying to generate those intuitions in you. Another way of sort of enhancing that intuition or like replying to it, maybe the room needs to move around. So we can imagine the room on wheels and the man pulling levers to make it zoom around. So now it's like in a robot. and it's interacting with the world. We'll give it little mechanical arms to like move objects and deal with things. It still doesn't look like it's understanding. Thank you. This building is going to be beautiful eventually. All right. Okay. All right. So he thinks this doesn't change the scenario at all. So putting this thing in a body really doesn't seem to change the situation at all. And Searle's conclusion is that computers will just never be intelligent. Digital computers operating on formal rules will just never be intelligent. And Harnad just wants us to conclude, he's got a weaker conclusion than Searle, just wants us to conclude that the Turing test doesn't give us enough identity to claim that the system is a cognitive system. So it's a much weaker claim. See if this is convincing to you. Look, just having identity of just being able to have a conversation isn't enough to attribute intelligence to the other side. It could still just be a simulation. All right, maybe something stronger then. So suppose we do T3, which is the total Turing test. The test should last an entire lifetime. It should involve many different contexts. So you've got a robot. It lives an entire life. You send it to kindergarten. You send it to elementary school. It has a terrible breakup with its significant other. It struggles to find a job. It gets depressed in its mid-20s. It has a whole life. Okay, so the lifetime level Turing test. It goes through all of the things that a person does in their whole life. And the whole time, you really can't tell the difference between this thing and any of the people that are around you. Now, are you willing to say, yeah, now that thing's intelligent? Yeah.
I would say if it wasn't programmed in explicitly
right.
what to do.
Well, I mean, it's
like if you were doing the Turing test with a machine, and
yep.
the machine all of a sudden decided, well, this test is stupid, this is all stupid, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
I'd say that machine probably intelligent.
But you could pre-program it to be mad, you're belligerent.
But it wasn't.
Okay, right. So that actually goes beyond this though, right? So this test is still just about outputs. It's still just about outputs. So you could have a rebellious outburst subroutine that's activated randomly and be like, oh, I hate this, and it flips the desk and runs out. So that's still a possibility. And we don't know anything, just from the total Turing test, we still don't know what's going on inside the machine. Now, is this enough? Is this enough for you to go, yeah, that thing's intelligent? Suppose it's passing the total Turing test. Yeah.
T3 wasn't enough. I don't think T3 would be enough.
Interesting. So you don't see any significant difference between holding a conversation and just having the whole lifetime. It's just like a really long conversation or something like that. Interesting. Okay. Again, earlier this lecture, I'm like, intuitions, those are dumb. Well, now I'm asking for your intuitions because this is where we end up when we don't have arguments. It's kind of the ground state. When you run out of arguments, all you've got left are intuitions. So, I don't know. Okay, let's go even further. The neuromimetic test. So now we're getting into the machinery. We could require that the testee uses the same sort of neural processes that we do. So not only do we have to have identity of behavior across an entire lifetime, so it's T3 plus, it's got to have the same neural mechanisms. I guess one question is this now too much? Like, do we need it to have the same neural processes as we do to attribute intelligence? Yeah.
If it does, then we can't analyze it.
Right. If it does have the same neural processes as we do, it's useless for our project of AI because we can already access our neural processes and we don't understand them. So, yeah. And also, it doesn't seem super relevant whether it's got exactly the same neural processes as we do, does it? I don't know. It doesn't seem super important to me that it run on the exact same hardware. Yeah, let me tell you about my intuitions for all that's worth. This is as far as Harnad goes. We could go one further. We could make up a fifth one, the quantum mimetic test. Roger Penrose has suggested actually that if you want to understand consciousness, you have to understand the brain at a quantum level. So quantum level identity. That's a lot. That's very identical. Yeah?
Something that like all these seem to be missing where it's just focused on one individual. You're just going down into the smaller parts, but you're not questioning like how two or three of these things work together. Do two or three of them convince us that
Well,
do they operate with a society?
even back in T3, we were assuming that it's integrated into society. So it's going through a whole life. Going through a whole life involves talking to people.
Would there be two of them?
I mean, it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter how many of them are, because if it's convincing you that if it's acting identically to us across a lifetime, then it would be interchangeable with other members of society.
But like if we're interacting in it, like if it's kind of like the observer bias, or like I'm looking at something and changing its state as well, and I see kind of what I want to see, or if I just have like a bunch of devices
No, it shouldn't.
on the island, should they just behave kind of like we
It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. Yeah. It should be by assumption of T3, it's identical to us in behavior across an entire lifetime. So it doesn't, assuming that it's any of us are integrated in society, it would be as well. Okay, so Harnad thinks that T3 is the right level. Harnad thinks that the neuromimetic identity is too much, just the Turing test is not enough. But if it's able to like live an entire life, deal with all of the different contexts that a human does, and therefore like give all of the same, like I've never seen nobody's ever seen my brain. I've never seen anybody else's brain. All of the evidence that I have that any of us are intelligent is just how we behave over a lifetime. So seems like T3 gives us the same evidence for intelligence of the machine that we all have of each other's intelligence. All right? I don't know. Yeah, so he just thinks T1 and T2 aren't enough. Therefore, T3 is good because T4 and so on are more. The problem is that this is not really like, this is really just a description of the goal rather than any picture of how to get to it. But I don't know. Okay. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. So, just quickly, another response to Searle. Consider the virtual systems reply. So the virtual systems reply has you have this is an image from the movie The Manchurian Candidate, where people kidnap this guy and give him programs that they program his mind. And when he gets the signal, I think he assassinates somebody. I don't remember. Okay, so suppose you take the guy from the room, and you write all these rules into him in the same way that you like brainwash him with the rules. And then not only is he, so we had the room on wheels before. Now instead of the room on wheels, it's the guy, and the guy not only writes out things, but now speaks the language and behaves appropriately, right? So he can like move through the world acting like a normal person who speaks Chinese, because he's memorized. We've hard coded these rules into his responses. Now does he understand? And some people are tempted to go, yeah. I mean, we've done weird things to this person, but they understand. You might be tempted by this thought. Okay. One last thing from Searle, and then we'll be done. Okay, so Searle's got this other argument from 93 in The Problem of Consciousness. And he wants to show once again that computers can never be intelligent. And furthermore, that we'll never come up with a theory of this stuff. So, distinguish intrinsic and attributed properties. Something has an intrinsic property if it's just got that property, regardless of what anybody says or thinks about it. An attributed property is something that it's only got that property because we say it does. So for example, money has value. It's not like money has intrinsic value. It has value because we say it does, right? You can see this collapse when hyperinflation happens. Everybody suddenly loses, I mean, when you lose confidence in the value of money, it stops having money. It's like It's like we all just wish it into being. And that's how it maintains its value, is we just, the collective value, the collective force of our belief imbues money with value. Yeah? Well, value, it could be, yeah. Value could be attributed rather than intrinsic. In the sense of money value, yeah, I would say it's intrinsic rather than, unless you say value to something. So Searle thinks that science really only applies to intrinsic properties. You can really only study the properties that things have in and of themselves. Okay? But if something is multiply realizable, like computation, he argues, then it's attributed rather than intrinsic. So we are the ones who say that a computer is doing computation in some sense. So we are the ones who interpret it as doing computation. As an intrinsic fact, it's just shuffling energy around. This is Searle's claim. So, like, he says, computation exists only relative to some agent or observer who imposes a computational interpretation on some phenomena. This is an obvious point. I should have seen it 10 years ago, but I did not. So we interpret machines as doing computation rather than them being intrinsically computational. But then, of course, there's got to be somebody there to interpret it as computation. And if we are just computers, then who's interpreting us to be computational? There's a kind of infinite regress here where, again, where does the understanding, where does the meaning get into the system? Where does it originate? Searle's claim is multiple realizability implies that the thing is not intrinsic. And if it's not intrinsic, you can't have a science of it. So you can't have a science if cognition is computation and therefore multiply realizable, then you can't have a science about it, is the basic argument. Okay, because we are already straining our computational resources, I'll just give you the counter argument real quick. Maybe self-organization is a thing that is both intrinsic and multiply realizable. So I take it that something can be self-organized whether we think it is or not. It's not like money. It's like if these are convection rolls. Look, it's either a convection roll or it's not, right? And in the heart of distant stars that we've never observed, there's convection going on. And it's not because we decided there's convection. It's just going on, right? So something is a dissipative system or it's not. It's going into spontaneous synchrony or it's not. It's near the edge of, it's at the critical point or it's not. Those are intrinsic features, but they are also multiply realizable. So take that, Searle. Your belief that something is must be intrinsic or must be extrinsic or interpreted rather than being intrinsic is just false because you were thinking about computers, you weren't thinking about self-organization. Yeah? Okay. That was a lot. And I consider that to be enough for today. Just a quick reminder, test 2 is on Tuesday. I will post a reminder on Quarkus. Remember, it's not here, it's an exam EX300. So feel free to email me questions or talk to me about it. And thanks.